Chapter 18. Kinslayer. Xitalia blinked hard in a desperate attempt to clear her vision. She could sense a threatening, malignant presence directly in front of her, but, for reasons unknown, couldn't quite resolve the image. Reflexively lifting her forelimbs into a defensive position, she felt a sudden blinding rush, as if she had just emerged from a long, dark tunnel into brilliant sunlight. As she shook her head with confusion, the fine details of her world came starkly back into view. The Queen quickly realized, with some considerable amount of embarrassment, she was seated in front of a mirror, with her own reflection staring accusingly back at her. A very welcome sense of calm quickly wrapped itself all around her like a warm blanket. She knew exactly where she was, and there was no need to be afraid. The room was small but elegantly appointed, and everything was just the way she liked it. This was her safe space, a place where she would not be disturbed without extremely good reason. It was the escape from chaos that she so desperately needed, to contemplate the next moments of her life, and, just as importantly, what those moments might mean for the future of her nest. As Xitalia now peered admiringly into the mirror, she had to admit the arachnid that stared back at her was certainly very pleasing to the eye. The genetics of X83, Y54, Z61 had been unusually generous. There was simply no denying that this was undoubtedly the kind of body you wore when you intended to achieve truly great things. How fortuitous, then, she was on the cusp of doing exactly that. Were she to succeed in this audacious invasion, which logistics had strongly suggested she would be, then the status and power of her nest would be virtually unassailable, all but guaranteeing her survival for many millennia to come. Of course, were she to fail, then her name would go down in history as an infamous tyrant who conceived to do the unthinkable and paid the ultimate price for an act of truly despicable treachery. It was funny how it worked like that. History would always be a fickle beast, ridden by the victor. Win, and you could shape the story told into that of your own image, a glorious tale of your rise to power, where even the worst of atrocities could be justified, or, at the very least, rationalized. Lose, and accept with equanimity, your story will be told through the lens of another, as little more than a stepping stone that paved the way for the glorious rise of the victor. The only real question open for debate was which side of the equation you fell upon, winner or loser. Xitalia firmly believed that she held her fate in the palm of her hand, and, like a master algebraist, she rearranged and modelled the equation to her will. As the Queen waited pensively for this pivotal moment to unfold, there was a soft but very precise knock on her door, instantly sending a powerful surge of electricity racing down the length of her legs.
"Enter,"
Xitalia called out in a voice seated in calm repose, betraying nothing of the fear and doubt that gnawed away at her stomach. The door silently arced up into the walls like a large set of symmetrical wings, leaving behind a dimly lit circular cavity shadowed by the shattered visage of Ximodian 13. Xitalia, still staring into the mirror, but with eyes now firmly focused on her Zihari general's battered reflection, irritably repeated her original command.
I said enter, so enter.
Ximodian limped his way awkwardly into the Queen's private chamber. She noted, with a mild amount of concern, 3 of his legs were missing, and that 2/3 of his face appeared to have been savagely raked by an eye gouger, a traditional Zihari hand-to-hand combat weapon of old. Turning away from the mirror so she could examine the damage in greater detail, the Queen was now able to observe that no less than 8 of his 9 eyes had been literally scratched from their sockets, meaning he was, technically speaking, 8/9 blind. Rather fortuitously for her general, a single eye remained in the top right hemisphere of his face, which very stoically held fast to her gaze. Several minor wounds pitted his body and limbs, and one particularly nasty, cauterized scar ran across the entire length of his thorax. The savage-looking cut faded away towards the posterior, before reappearing with a vengeance along the side of his abdomen. Well, there was no escaping the fact one of her most loyal Zihari generals was in truly terrible shape, and would never command the battlefield ever again. Yet, despite the horror show that stood resolutely in front of her, Xitalia felt a considerable sense of hopeful anticipation. Damaged goods or not, he was still very much alive, and apparently had seen fit to report the latest news directly. This most likely, but not necessarily, meant only one thing, and as a result, the immediate sense of anxious excitement she now felt was almost palpable.
You have news, Ximodian?
Xitalia asked perfunctorily. She did not, however, bother to ask after his health, and nor should he have expected it. After all, the Queen and her general were about to rewrite history and forever change the face of Xicadian culture as a result. This moment was bigger than the both of them, though from the Queen's newly altered perspective, she had now become the moment itself. So, to her way of thinking anyway, it was effectively a point without a difference.
It is done, my Queen.
So this was it then. In the utterance of just those few short words, her whole world had changed now and forevermore.
And what of Queen Xiana?
The Great Queen was captured with minor injuries, but is otherwise alive and well.
Xitalia tried very hard to hide her disappointment. The fact of the matter was, it would have been far preferable if Xiana had perished during the course of the invasion. After all, it was one thing for the Queen to fall in the midst of battle, but quite another to die while in the captivity of her victor, especially when that victor was also her own daughter. No, that would not look anywhere near as favourable in the history books. For all his loyalty and talent as a battlefield commander, Ximodian was still painfully naive, and the Queen decided, at least for the time being anyway, to change the subject.
And what then of the battle itself?
The battle, my Queen, was over almost before it began. They were completely unprepared for such an unprecedented assault, and simply put, their vastly superior numbers counted for virtually nothing in the face of the Shebot onslaught.
Xitalia, noting again the damage her general wore all over his brutalized body, could not help but find his characterization of her glorious victory to be almost comically heroic. Nonetheless, his point was well made and unequivocally borne out by the simple fact he stood before her now with the enemy queen secured and held prisoner. Indeed, had he not actually succeeded, there was little doubt in Xitalia's mind Ximodian would have chosen to die in the heat of battle, rather than facing the shame of reporting his failure to strategize and execute her ingenious planning. Maintaining a robotically emotionless voice, the Xihari general continued to deliver his report.
My queen, I can only think to describe it as an unprecedented slaughter made all the more remarkable by the exalted status of our foe. The speed and efficiency of the Series 2 She-Bots had to be seen to be believed, and for better or worse, the face of battle will no doubt forever be changed. Of course, the element of complete surprise also played a critical role. In fact, I seriously doubt we would have succeeded had Nestziana been fully prepared, or even prepared in any sense of the word whatsoever. We were, after all, family.
Ximodian's troublesome familial reference disturbed Xitalia greatly, despite the obvious success of her Xibot-augmented army. No, it was crucially important she set her general's mind at ease and assure him that he had done a truly righteous thing, something history would remember and memorialize with honor.
Ah, but my most magnificent child, I always knew that you possessed the potential to far exceed your modest station as a three-brained Shihari elite. There was a very good reason that I chose you above all others to lead the campaign to overthrow Queen Siana. So please be assured, Ximodian, that you have played a pivotal part in what will no doubt prove to be the single greatest moment in the entire history of Nestxitalia, both now and far, far into the future.
The Queen continued to stare unwaveringly into her general's sole remaining eye. As much as his truly disgusting appearance grossed her out, now was definitely not the time to be squeamish. This was a moment of dangerous volatility, and she had to be sure not to reveal even the smallest hint her words were anything other than authentically heartfelt.
I can think of no greater honor to bestow upon you than to ensure that your lineage will be given priority preference through every generation of future Xihari born with 5 or more brains. The name Ximodian, from this day forth, will be synonymous with both military and intellectual greatness. Above all else, I can also promise you this: our allies will love you, and our enemies will fear you, for the rest of Nestxitalia's natural life.
Ximodian's one good eye finally released its unflinching lock on his queen and looked down at the floor for just the briefest of moments. Such a minor change in demeanour nevertheless spoke volumes, coming as it did from her most senior military general. "Ah, now I've got you," Xitalia thought triumphantly to herself. By promoting this three-brained idiot to the highest station possible, she had carefully cultivated a general with the blind loyalty needed to pull off such a controversial invasion. So she absolutely hadn't been kidding when she said she had chosen him for a very good reason. Now then was the perfect time to turn the conversation back towards the far more critical issue still to be resolved.
Now then, we need to talk a little more about Xiana, as unpleasant as the topic may be. Tell me then, Ximodian, has word spread of her disappointingly inconvenient incarceration?
Xitalia had been sure to choose her words very carefully. Disappointing for who, exactly? Answer: for Queen Xitalia. And now Ximodian could do little other than conclude that, sans any ambiguity or doubt.
To the best of my knowledge, this information has not yet been shared beyond the strike force that took the inner keep. My queen.
Xitalia gave her general a performative glare.
Well, all things considered, I suppose the situation could be worse. No, as unnecessarily complicated as this unexpected outcome may be, it is still very much recoverable.
Xitalia paused for a brief but calculated moment.
Ziana is much more than just another elder Selectile. She is still our first and only great queen, so it would not do for it to become known that she has suffered the shame of being captured alive. Her legacy surely deserves better than that. Wouldn't you agree, General Simodian?
Simodian remained silent for a dangerously long moment.
The problem is your wisdom is such. More often than not, it can only be properly understood by yourself. The Brotherhood have therefore sought out their own moral counsel, and every other Sihari, myself very much included, feel the most righteous way forward sits balanced on the edge of Zed's eternal blade.
The general wordlessly unsheathed his ceremonial knife, and Xitalia felt as if she had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. Her life had been put in his hands, and despite so many years of fastidious grooming, her most senior general still felt doubt. Simodian would not say the words directly, but he would nevertheless point to them with invidious innuendo. Ziana is Xitalia's mother, and therefore Xitalia's queen. This, of course, also made her Simodian's grandmother, and he clearly understood this as more than just rational fact, but as a sense of dangerously conflicting loyalties. Alive and well. Those were the exact words he had used, as if it mattered that Ziana was not just alive, but also in a state of wellness. The formula that sat in front of her was almost complete, but in her rush to cross the finish line, it now threatened to all fall apart. She had to take great care to ensure the equation balanced perfectly, with no remainder left behind to tip the scales. If Simodian had doubts or feelings of split loyalty, then she could be certain that so too did many more in her army, Zihari and Zimatiri alike. But if she was able to control her most senior general, none of the others would matter. They would all fall into line, and her future would at last be secure. Sometimes she really had to wonder exactly what they expected of her. Was she supposed to just wait and do nothing until their proximity and rapidly reducing natural resources all but forced Ziana to make a move against her? The equation, if expressed and calculated in that form, had only one possible answer, and it spelt the end for Nest Xitalia, as it was ruthlessly consumed back into the mother nest. Times were changing, and the world had boundaries and limits they had never before been forced to confront. Yet confront them she most certainly had. And surely it was for this very reason Nest Xitalia was the future of the Xicadian species, as it alone was willing to see through the inflexible structure of the old paradigm and shatter an archaic taboo in the process. No, it was nothing less than what any truly modern Selectial queen could be expected to do to protect the future of her nest. When all else was said and done, it was a story as old as time itself. Survival of the fittest, and survival of the most cunning. She may not have been able to match her mother's nest in terms of raw strength, but strength alone was never going to carry the day, not when your greatest rivals suddenly became your own family. And of course, had the situation been reversed, there would have been no place for Xitalia in the new world order. It was only right then that there would be no place for Ziana, now that her nest had fallen to such a courageously preemptive attack. To the spoils go the victor, and Ximodian must be made to see the inalienable wisdom in that fact. It was not personal, it was just business, and that business was survival.
Please never forget, Ximodian, that this was not a war I ever wanted and tried very hard to avoid. No, it was a war that was quite literally thrust upon me. Your divine purpose is to serve Nest Xitalia, and you know as well as I do that I am Nest Xitalia. Every other consideration must come a very distant second to that. You were lovingly taught and trained from a very young age that of all loyalties, it is loyalty to your nest, and therefore your queen, that comes before all others. Trust me, my child, what you have just managed to achieve has all but secured our dynasty, but we are not all the way there yet. What still needs to be done is of utmost importance, lest we risk wasting the many lives that have already been so tragically shed, both Nest Xitalia and Nest Ziana alike.
Well, this was it then, the final expression in her most precious of equations, meticulously constructed as the solution to the ultimate problem. How to stay alive. The Queen earnestly leaned in closer towards her general, in a demonstrative attempt to demonstrate her trust in his loyalty.
Ziana died bravely, defending her nest to the very last. Convince your subordinates to make this minor adjustment to the historical records. It's all I need from you, and I will take care of everything else. Do this for your queen. Do this for Nest Xitalia, and your legacy of greatness will be assured for all time.
Xitalia waited tensely, in frightened expectation of her one-eyed general. He stood before her now as a tragically spent force. But he still had one final part to play in her Game of Thrones. It all came down to this one single moment, and she desperately needed him to complete the job without falling at the final hurdle, that of his own infuriatingly rigid moral code. As Ximodian stared at his diminutive little queen, he could not help but notice how different she looked when seen through the lens of a single eye. She was somehow so greatly reduced, yet at the same time almost grotesquely more pronounced. Surrounded in a frame of darkness, she became the singular focus of his undivided attention. And it was not an altogether pleasant experience. He could not help but be struck by the paradox that to see less had, through an act of perverse cruelty, somehow unlocked his potential to see more. Well, regardless of whether that was actually true or not, he had always seen his queen, and knew in sordid, intimate detail the twisted mechanics of her heart. For that reason alone, he could never love Xitalia, no matter how much he might have wished that he could. Yet, when all was said and done, she was still his queen. No, whether he liked it or not, it simply could not be denied. Such courage and base instinct for survival had kept the nest in a constant state of growth, in the face of ever-decreasing resources. It was, in fact, their very success that imperiled them now, as two thriving nests in such close proximity was always going to spell trouble, sooner or later. Xitalia, naturally enough, had opted for sooner, and had stolen the initiative by breaking a sacred cultural norm that the daughter would always, and without resistance, acquiesce to the mother. Queen Xitalia knew, every bit as well as he did, this could and should have been a completely bloodless coup. Well, apart from hers anyway. So here he found himself then, through no fault of his own, in the midst of an impossible dilemma. He could slay Xitalia right this very moment with a single swift blow, and the crisis would all be over. Killing her would be as easy as slicing her skull in two like a razor-bug egg. And the only thing that could possibly save her now was his own tortured self-doubt as to the most righteous course of action. The terrible truth of the matter was, his short but revelatory encounter with Ziana had all but convinced him to keep her alive. She was exactly the kind of queen he had always wanted to serve, which would make killing Xitalia the easiest thing in the world. When all was said and done, could his mother really blame him for choosing the great queen over her? He was, after all, a natural-born killer, and the alternative option to do nothing felt instinctively weak. Indeed, had she not herself once told him, all other things being equal, he should always trust his instincts? As Simodian flipped the mental coin that would decide Xitalia's fate, he decided that rising above his own genetic programming was the right choice to make, precisely because it felt so much like the wrong one. Xitalia would live, which meant Ziana would die, although certainly not by his or any other Zihari's hand, as the Queen was far too clever to make such a silly mistake as that. No, if Xitalia really wanted Ziana dead, then she would have to do her own wet work, as she continued to pave her way to ever greater power and influence. Who knows? Perhaps her blinding ambition really had clouded her to the fact such a despicably loathsome deed would follow her like a dark, malignant cloud through the many millennia to come. Simodian, having apparently now come to a decision, stood himself to full attention, and for a very brief moment it seemed as if his injuries almost magically faded away into little more than superficial scars. The Queen, suppressing her surprise, quickly realized he was still a force to be reckoned with, and every bit as formidable as ever. Perhaps his days on the battlefield were not quite over just yet.
As always, my queen, I remain your faithful servant. Now, if you will please excuse me, I will pass on your instructions as to the official but vexingly fictitious status of your mother, the great Queen Xiana.
Ximodian almost regretfully resheathed his blade, and Xitalia was quite sure she had never before felt such a profound sense of relief. The equation balanced perfectly, and once again she had proven herself to be the master algebraist of her time. She would even forgive Ximodian the astounding boldness of his closing rhetorical barb. Let him have his petty little victories, while she continued to stay focused on the much bigger picture. After all, she would still be alive long after her latest Zihari pawn had long since died and turned to dust. Nonetheless, despite his astounding lack of appropriate decorum, as a solemn demonstration of her magnanimous benevolence, she would hold true to her promise. The name Ximodian would indeed be permanently elevated from that of the mundane, three-brained Zihari to the truly elite among her children, those of 5 brains and above. And after all, it would be a more than fitting forever reminder of this remarkable day in her own glorious history. Speaking of glory, it was finally time to get her hands dirty. It was not exactly every day that you got to personally kill a queen and your own mother at the same time. Happy days were here at last. Xitalia was just about to tell Ximodian he was free to leave and carry out her orders, but was rather startled to discover that he had already gone. Queen Xitalia stood outside the office door of Dr. Xicadian 1020, racked with paralysing indecision. She started to enter, hesitated, turned to leave, then for the umpteenth time changed her mind yet again. With a look of consternation written all over her face, Xitalia pressed a frustrated digit to the entry panel, and the door obediently opened wide. With a determined set to her gaze, she swept straight past the receptionist, who was just about to object furiously before recognising the Queen. The doctor, who had lifted his gaze with an almost comically startled expression, appeared to be in the middle of a consultation with an elderly Zimitiri drone.
Doctor, we need to speak right now.
Really, my queen. This is a truly appalling violation of medical protocol. Surely you can see that I'm currently rather busy with another patient. So if you would kindly just make your way back out to reception, I promise I'll be with you just as soon as possible.
Xitalia took an infuriated glance at the drone, as if just now noticing they were there.
And exactly what part of the word now do you not understand?
Dr. Xicadian looked towards his patient and prepared to make his apologies, but they had already risen from the examination table, a look of pure, unadulterated terror written all over their face. The doctor sighed heavily as he turned back to face the Queen.
You are right, of course, my queen. I forget myself. Now then, what is it exactly that needs such urgent attention? Has my queen stubbed a claw, perhaps? Or maybe she has eaten a bad batch of bloodworms and is feeling a little under the weather.
The contemptuous tone of the doctor strongly suggested he thought she was neither injured nor unwell.
I have a job for you, Doctor. A very important job, and a job that will require the utmost discretion, something that you have demonstrated a pleasing proclivity for in the past.
Xicadian, who wore corrective lenses, tilted his head and stared curiously at the Queen over the rim of his glasses.
All right, I'm listening, my Queen. Tell me more about this so-called job of yours.
The doctor's almost comical lack of decorum seemed to be a singularly unique feature he alone was allowed to indulge in. The fact he was nothing but a garden-variety Zimmateri only served to make it that much more shocking. Some speculated he must have performed an act of profound loyalty, which in turn had apparently afforded him the right to speak to the Queen absentee any deference or propriety. In reality, however, the doctor was little more than a charming scoundrel who had evolved into a highly entertaining social experiment. Arachnids were routinely put to death for far more minor acts of insubordination. As a result, Xicadian enjoyed an elevated level of social celebrity and infamy due simply to his seemingly unique ability to get away with what others very clearly could not. Nonetheless, his loyalty and usefulness could simply not be denied. Had this not actually been the case, or were it ever to cease being the case, then this experiment would be brought to a very speedy and painful conclusion. Fortunately for the doctor, he seemed to possess both the wit and wisdom to fully appreciate this vitally crucial fact. His highly unorthodox relationship with the Queen had grown to the point he had even been promoted to the lofty role of Queen's physician.
You have some knowledge and skill in the field of molecular biology, yes, Doctor?
Xicadian stared at the Queen with a flat, humourless expression.
Forgive my bluntness, but I can't imagine my Queen is in the habit of asking questions that she very clearly already knows the answer to. So maybe you should just get right to the point.
The Queen's eyes flashed with the kind of anger that would have had most other arachnids quickly reassessing their life goals.
The point, my good doctor, is that it is finally time for you to put some of that research I so generously allowed you to indulge in to some actual practical use.
Oh, really? And how exactly is that, my Queen?
Very simple, Doctor. I need you to collect an exceedingly rare sample of a viral agent. The kind of agent that is normally only available under a very specific and unique set of circumstances, where collection would neither be practical or acceptable in any possible sense of those words.
Xicadian's mandibles began to twist in perplexed consternation.
My Queen speaks in riddles. What is the exact nature of this virus? For example, is it highly transmissible? And what of its mortality rate? Is there an already existing vaccine available? Depending on the answer to questions such as these and many others, some carefully planned isolation and quarantine protocols may need to be carefully prepared and put into place.
The Queen waved a hand dismissively.
Let me put your mind at ease, good doctor. Firstly, it can only be contracted by direct infusion into the bloodstream. Secondly, the virus is completely harmless to 99.99% of the population. To that other singularly unique fraction of a percent, it is either 100% fatal or 100% transformative, depending entirely on whether it is mother to daughter or daughter to mother, and I'll leave it to you to decide which is which.
The doctor suddenly found himself unable to speak. His mind raced wildly as he struggled to collect his thoughts and regain his composure. What she was asking for was nothing less than pure heresy. Was she actually volunteering to share her own seed? Surely not, as it would mean the literal end of her nest were it ever to become public knowledge it had been used outside the ritual act of transition. So if not her, then who else could she possibly be referring to? The dangerous rumours were she did in fact have a queen alive and in captivity. None other than that of her own mother, the great Queen Xiana. The full picture quickly fell into place, and if he could not speak before, now he felt like he might never speak again.
Snap out of it, Doctor. Nest Xiana has fallen, and I'm quite sure you have already heard the rumours, so stop playing the fool. As it turns out, though, this is one of those very rare occasions where the rumours are actually true. Clearly this is a problem, but nevertheless it presents a uniquely risk-free opportunity to acquire a sample of the Imperial virus for future study and potential exploitation.
Xicadian blinked like a dumbfounded idiot who had at long last realised his whole life had been one big lie. Taboo upon taboo, tumbling down like rocks off a mountain face before his very eyes. For better or worse, he now found himself unwittingly woven into the fabric of history in the making. Had the Queen not seen the terrible risk? Or did she believe in his loyalty so blindly she simply couldn't conceive of his betrayal? After all, were he to choose such a path, Xiana herself would celebrate him as one of the greatest Zimatiri in the history of their species. He would be immortalized for all time as the Doctor who single-handedly brought down a heretic tyrant. Yet, were he to follow that particular path to vanity-fueled glory, the opportunity to secure a sample of the virus would forever be lost. The truth of the matter was, the barriers to collecting such a sample could only be described as legion, both practical and cultural in nature. Xicadian swallowed hard. The chance to study this virus was an unthinkably remote possibility, akin to unlocking the secret of faster-than-light travel, or understanding the true nature of quantum uncertainty. His life was dedicated to the service and progress of the scientific project, and he could not easily turn his back on it. Not now that such a staggeringly improbable opportunity had seen fit to serve itself up to him, and in a way that was virtually impossible to say no to. So, it was decided then. He would do his Queen's bidding, choosing the path of scientific immortality over that of heroic vanity. Was Xitalia truly a heretic tyrant? Without question. But tyrant queens were the norm, not the exception, and heresy was just a disparaging way to frame the actions of a true innovator, both courageous and stupid enough to break free from the cultural chains of tradition. Xitalia was his queen, and there were no others quite like her, not even the great Queen Xiana. He would choose to walk the path not taken, even if it ultimately led to their mutual destruction.
My Queen, I am truly honoured. You can rely on me to do whatever needs to be done.
Two burly-looking guards stood resolutely either side of a thick prison door, where the well-hidden maximum security wing was discreetly located. This part of the nest lay far below the central maze of public passageways, and knowledge of its existence much less access to it, was on a strictly as-needs basis. Xitalia, just like every other queen, very much appreciated the heat, and of course being so deep underground provided her with exactly that. But the air, this far below the surface, tasted disagreeably stale. She found herself unpleasantly reminded of the fact the ventilation pipes had been very poorly maintained over the countless centuries since the facility's original excavation. The Queen, offering nothing more than a silent glare, waited impatiently as one of the guards wordlessly unlocked the prison cell door. With some considerable amount of effort, the large guard slowly began to push the door wide. The unfortunate reality of the situation was, while she visited this space only rarely, whenever she actually did, one of the first things that inevitably came to mind was resources desperately needed to be put into a major upgrade and refurbishment. Naturally enough, she instantly forgot about getting the work done from the moment she left, right up until the next time she visited. The guard beckoned the Queen to enter, but to her considerable consternation, she was unexpectedly gripped with a strong sense of apprehension. Upon reluctantly making her entrance, she then found herself casting a furtive gaze around the shadowy stone walls. Dr. Xicadian, who was already there to greet her, manually adjusted the cell's lighting levels all the way up, which, as it turned out, was still uncomfortably dim.
Well, I certainly hope I didn't keep you waiting too long, Doctor. But in any event, I trust you were able to adequately arrange the particulars of this cell to your liking, yes?
Only barely.
Xicadian replied belligerently, before then quickly adding,
But yes, my queen, all the necessary adjustments have been performed, as you have no doubt already observed.
So this then is your only willing ally, Xitalia?
A voice echoed forth mockingly from the far end of the cell.
Could you not find even a single Shihari who was willing to aid and abet you in this final act of spiritual desecration?
The captive queen's chained and elevated body cast twisted and distorted shadows on the stone wall behind her.
Oh, come now, Ziana. Such petulant and petty words are surely hardly befitting of a great queen, especially when spoken to her one and only daughter.
Ziana let out a derisive little laugh.
And yet you think this prison cell and the chains that bind me are somehow befitting of such a sacred reunion, my perpetually frightened little child?
Queen Xitalia gave her mother a coldly appraising glare.
I think they are necessary in order that Xicadian can finally move out of the Dark Ages and embrace the modern ideals that outdated traditionalist queens, such as yourself, for example, have made it virtually impossible to realise.
Xitalia, child, you don't seriously expect me to be deceived by such a laughably disingenuous display of virtue. If a mother and her daughter cannot speak frankly to one another in a moment such as this, then when exactly can they? But please, don't mistake the nature of my contempt. I find your instinct for survival to be an entirely admirable trait, and one that I would be far more inclined to support were it not for the fact that your act of heresy appears to have cost me my nest.
Well, on the subject of survival, Ziana, I must admit that it is more than just a little bit perplexing as to exactly why you allowed yourself to be captured alive. Am I supposed to believe that now that you have finally tasted defeat after 13,000 years of unbroken rule, the rules have suddenly changed? Please do feel free to correct me if I'm mistaken, but surely tradition strongly dictates that a queen is honour-bound to take her own life, rather than fall into the hands of the invader.
And as per tradition, I would not have hesitated to do exactly that, were this actually a traditional invasion. But you broke a sacred law. Daughter does not attack mother. A truly despicable act only made all the worse by such a cowardly sneak attack. No, Xitalia, it is you who has committed the crime against tradition by founding your nest embarrassingly too close to your place of birth.
Queen Xiana sighed heavily.
But a mother always wants to think the best of her daughter, even when in my heart of hearts I always knew that were you not to heed my warnings and relocate, then a day of reckoning would surely come.
And relocate where exactly?
Queen Xitalia snapped tersely.
No, Xiana, this is not the Xicadian of old. Xicadian nests populate every square corner of the planet, from top to bottom, end to end. Oh, and by the way, I absolutely did heed your warnings, which is exactly why you now lie strung up and chained in my dungeon keep.
The chains that held Xiana captive began to rattle and clank as she momentarily struggled against them.
You speak in half-truths to feed your lies. When you left home with my blessing, Xicadia was still a land of boundless possibilities. You could have gone anywhere, and it was only cowardice fueled by lazy inertia that led you to choose the first barely suitable location. An abandoned nest that I had defeated several millennia ago, if memory serves correctly.
Queen Xitalia's stony silence was telling.
This speaks clearly to an aberration in your genetic inheritance that should have been expunged long ago, if not for the misplaced love of a mother for her daughter. No, Xitalia, it is a crime against the natural order that your lineage has been allowed to continue, rather than be weeded from the genetic pool, as nature had most surely always intended it.
Xitalia remained silent for a very long moment.
You speak of virtue and truth between mother and daughter, yet tell such lies as this? Am I meant to seriously believe that you chose to live in spite of the fall of your nest, simply because it was I, your precious daughter, who defeated you? Or just maybe, when it came right down to it, you found yourself lacking in the courage of your conviction. Perhaps you lie chained before me now, strung up in captivity like a bloodworm to the slaughter, because you discovered within your own timid heart, even this shameful fate was preferred to facing your own certain death.
Xiana began to laugh with unbridled contempt.
Oh, Xitalia, my poor little Xitalia. Your words are but the result of the mirror you so desperately seek answers from, in order to try and make sense of a world that you cannot possibly hope to comprehend when viewed through your own grotesquely distorted lens. But please let me try to clear up your confusion. Consider it my one last act of mercy towards a lost and lonely child, tragically destined to know only pain, misery and suffering, as she clings pitifully to her life through the many millennia to come. I do not fear death, you blind and witless fool. Like all truly honourable queens, I simply accept that when it is my time, Zed's eternal blade will claim me, as the storm of chaos is destined to claim us all. I chose to live because my encounter with your brave Shihari general, none other than my very own grandchild, all but convinced me that you would surely fall by his divine hand of righteous judgment, and that the natural order would then be blessedly restored. I can only imagine then that by an act of breathtakingly bad fortune, his hand was tragically stayed, for reasons I could not ever hope to divine. So here we now find ourselves at a moment of true infamy, as a hopelessly broken queen unwittingly consummates a path that is destined to bring great tragedy, not just to herself, but to all of Xicadia. Your rise is our doom, and I lament that most fatefully ill-favoured of days when I chose to grant you your freedom.
Xiana let out a tragic, almost melancholy sigh.
If only your Xylinian body had kept its original name, that of X22, Y51, Z36, and had instead been consumed, worn and then discarded like a filthy and ruined rag, destined to reside on the walls of my own hall of remembrance, where with the wisdom of hindsight I think we can both agree it had always truly belonged.
Queen Xitalia, with unconstrained rage now blazing in her eyes, rose up on her hind legs as she mirrored the ritual posture of transition being involuntarily maintained by her helplessly captive but infuriatingly composed mother.
Doctor, prepare this insufferable bitch for extraction, so I can finally send her into the razor-sharp arms of Zed's eternal blade.
My queen.
the doctor blurted out while rushing clumsily towards the captive queen. With a metallic cylinder in his left hand and a small heat gun in his right, he began to seal the flanged edges of the cylinder to the belly of Ziana's exposed thorax. After quickly checking his work, Xicadian beat a hasty retreat, offering the queen a small nod of his head. With Ziana now fully prepared, Xitalia's expression quickly changed from that of enraged anticipation and into one of icy cold, seasoned contempt.
Your hatefully twisted rhetoric holds no power over me anymore, Ziana. But before I send you into oblivion, allow me to demonstrate my mercy by gifting you one final glimpse into a glorious past that will soon be forgotten forever.
Xitalia gestured irritably at the doctor, who in turn hastily handed her the fossilized head of a Xylinetti queen.
Look what I just happened to find lying around in your throne room, Mother. I have been reliably informed by my Jihari scientists that this ancient fossil is indeed over 12,000 years old, exactly as the fables have always claimed it to be. But I think they must surely have been mistaken, and that a more thorough analysis will prove the legends to be nothing more than a myth, no doubt perpetuated by a deceitful queen intent on building her own fraudulent legend. Nevertheless, I wonder what I should do with such precious memorabilia, and one that so iconically corroborates your rise to power.
Queen Xitalia fell to an expectant silence, while holding the head triumphantly out in front of her. She continued to wait patiently until Ziana reluctantly turned her gaze upon it. Seizing the moment, Xitalia gleefully crushed it in her hand, but immediately felt as if she had just been viciously bitten. She involuntarily cried out in agonized pain, and as she looked down at her open palm accusingly, she saw 2 rows of disembodied, razor-sharp teeth deeply buried into her exoskeleton. A river of dark blood now streamed freely down to the floor as Xitalia desperately began to pluck the teeth out of her blooded palm, dropping them into the sticky pool of blood below. Queen Ziana, eyes shining brightly, began to laugh maniacally.
You just can't get anything right, can you, Xitalia? Not even your victories. Whatever did I do to deserve such a disappointing child?
Xitalia lifted a malignant gaze away from her hand and towards her mother, as a needle-sharp spike began to emerge ominously from the centre of her thorax.
Heresy!
Ziana cried out hysterically as Xitalia lunged in violently towards her, plunging the spike deep into her mother's side. The captive queen gasped with shock as her own spike autonomically emerged into the confines of the hermetically sealed cylinder. Keeping her gaze firmly fixed to Ziana's face, Xitalia held a hand out expectantly. The doctor wordlessly placed a very large surgical knife into her ready and waiting palm.
Please, Mother, allow me to introduce you to a literal manifestation of Zed's eternal blade.
Shiana's eyes instantly went wide with terror.
Now, Mother, do try to be brave. After all, you can at least take some solace in the fact that I fully intend to burn your reputation to the ground.
Xitalia pressed her mandibles hard up against Ziana's ear.
Tell me what you see in my mirror of mirrors now, you infernal bitch.
With a sardonic, shit-eating grin spread wide across her face, Queen Xitalia ferociously plunged the knife deep into the crown of Ziana's head, burying it all the way up into the hilt. The prison cell was suddenly filled with what sounded like 100 voices, all crying out at once, and both Xitalia and the doctor made an involuntary move for the door. However, the haunting cries began to quickly fade out as the great queen's body slumped forward heavily. She now hung lifelessly from the chains, and the eerily dancing shadows on the wall behind her came at last to a merciful rest.
By the shadow of Xicades, how was that even possible?
The doctor exclaimed, with a mixture of equal parts wonder and horror combined.
Nothing but an exploitative acoustic trick,
Xitalia replied dismissively.
No, I assure you, my good doctor. When you have heard yourself die as many times as I have, you learn a thing or two about how to make a melodramatic exit. Now then, do you plan on finishing the job or not?
Dr. Xicadian quickly retrieved a steaming flask from a medical-grade chili bin and then hastily scuttled his way over to the fallen queen. He carefully placed the flask over the cylinder and then smoothly pulled on a plunger attached to the bottom of the flask. It began to make a small sucking sound, followed by a very distinctive pop. The doctor gently lifted the flask away from Ziana's body as a few small drops of liquid nitrogen softly splashed down to the floor. With the flask now secured, he briskly scuttled his way back over to the bin, which had two bright yellow vertical arrows embossed onto its side. The doctor surreptitiously placed the flask into a snugly fitting pocket before quickly sealing the chili bin's lid with an almost comical look of relief. He paused briefly to recompose himself before entering a code into a small digital panel, which caused the bin to emit 5 quick, audible pips, followed by a single, long beep. Xicadian gave the bin a small, reassuring pat, and then turned triumphantly towards his queen. Xitalia appeared not to be paying him any attention, and was instead just staring vacantly at the body hanging lifelessly from the chains.
We've done it, my queen. The sample is secure, and the future shape of Xicadia itself now belongs to Nest Xitalia.
Xitalia stared at the doctor with confused, unfocused eyes, which nonetheless quickly returned back to the present moment.
Yes, Doctor, we have, haven't we? And I rather think that it does, doesn't it?
As Xitalia stared into the pining eyes of her doctor, she could not help but feel she had missed something of critical importance. But what was it exactly? What was this thing niggling at the back of her mind? Xitalia continued to peer inquiringly into the doctor's face, that she might yet divine an understanding of what he was thinking. A few uncomfortable moments of silence continued to tick by as the Queen struggled to understand what she had missed. No, there was simply no question about it, the Queen thought to herself worriedly. Rightly or wrongly, the good doctor clearly believes he has done something truly exceptional, and was now expectantly waiting for his reward. Despite the heat, an icy cold chill suddenly ran down the full length of the Queen's legs, and for a very brief moment she thought she might collapse to the floor. The good doctor could quite literally have betrayed her into oblivion. How, by the gods of Xicadia, could she have failed to have seen it? It would have been the easiest thing in the world for him to have infected her with Ziana's imperial virus, and in doing so, he would have achieved a level of status and fame far beyond anything she herself could ever have hoped to have given him. She could really only think to describe it as a truly appalling lack of foresight on her own behalf, and right at the precipice of her greatest triumph. It was so embarrassingly obvious with the wisdom of hindsight, and yet, with her mind so fixated on crossing the finish line, she had somehow failed to see the terrible danger standing right in front of her. No doubt the good doctor believed she had seen the risk all along, and had apparently trusted him enough to have literally put her life in his hands. This was, of course, an utterly absurd notion, but, under the circumstances, was a useful fiction that should probably now be treated as if it was real. The fact of the matter was, intentional or not, he had come through for her big time, and in doing so had demonstrated an unprecedented level of loyalty. Too bad for him, then, that he would never personally get to study the virus. It had been her very firm intention right from the start to quite literally put it on ice for the next several generations to come. Simple common sense dictated she wait until the political heat had died off before allowing it to be discreetly researched. Queen Xitalia could not help but notice the doctor's smile was becoming increasingly fractured with the passing of every moment. Well, if he thought he was about to be rewarded simply because it was what he deserved, he had another thing coming. As luck would have it, though, this was never a question of reward. The bottom line was this type of loyalty was far too valuable not to be exploited. So she may as well strike while the iron was hot, and put him out of his misery.
My good doctor, just out of pure curiosity, how do you feel about this whole living forever thing?
Queen Xitalia sat quietly in Dr. Xicadian's clinic as he applied an antiseptic numbing pad to her palm.
Just a temporary measure, my queen, until we can get you booked in for some very minor cosmetic surgery.
The doctor quickly began wrapping her hand with a large, flexible bandage, and Xitalia could not help but think he was winding it up a little too tightly. However, although her hand throbbed painfully under its pressure, it did little to diminish her sense of revelatory elation. After all, a truly terrifying existential threat to her future had at long last been permanently eliminated, and nothing but boundless opportunity now stood before her.
All done, my queen.
The doctor announced with a mildly patronising tone, a gratuitous smile spreading inexorably across his face and mandibles.
Not even close.
The Queen shot back contemptuously.
No, I can assure you, my good doctor, that I have scarcely even begun.
The doctor's mandibles began to twitch enthusiastically, but for some reason she could no longer make out what he was saying. His face began to melt like a distorted painting, before racing away into the distance as if she had just been sucked into a long, dark tunnel. When the Queen finally re-emerged back out into the light, she found herself peering witlessly into a mirror, but, very frustratingly, could not recall the ID of the body in front of her. She tentatively reached a digit towards her image. "Who am I?" she thought to herself, with a sense of genuine confusion. The moment her finger met its reflection, the mirror fractured apart into ever smaller pieces until she was completely surrounded by countless billions of tiny little splinters. The shattered glass of the mirror continued to fragment until it became virtually indistinguishable from the obfuscating fog polluting her consciousness. Like a disembodied mind desperately trying to find its way back to reality, she suddenly broke through to the surface, and her world came rushing starkly back into view. Well, that just happened, the Queen thought to herself numbly. Seriously though, it never ceased to amaze her how it always felt like the first time through. She understood all too clearly now that, in the great scheme of things, Zithuselah was nothing to get worked up about. In point of fact, he was less than nothing. A bloodworm under her foot. He was little more than a trivial inconvenience, and not worthy of even the smallest amount of concern. She would enjoy breaking him, though, and seeing his will drain away as she squeezed the last vestiges of hope from his naively infantile little soul. No. Fuck Zithuselah. And fuck that Zybot too, for that matter. They were there to be used, after all. And use them she most certainly would, one way or another. Flexibility was the name of the game. If he refused to fit through a square hole, then simple logic dictated that she should push him through a round one instead. And just like that, all her problems would be solved. In the end, it was all about having the humility to reshape your goals to make them attainable. And she would do exactly that. Seemingly right on cue, the doorway to her Hall of Remembrance dematerialized, and the Queen quickly exited the holographic chamber. Both Xicanda and the High Priestess were expectantly waiting to receive her, almost as if they had known exactly when her trip would end, right down to the very last second. Well, this was precision science after all, and as such, was to be fully expected. The priestess, who wore an irritatingly anxious look on her face, earnestly inquired as to how the Queen was feeling. However, before Xitalia had a chance to reply, an urgent incoming alert from Dr. Xycatica flitted up on her retinal display. She instinctively looked to her hand, and was rather startled to notice there was no bandaging to be found. With a small, self-deprecating shake of her head, Xitalia made a dismissive gesture towards the priestess, and then activated the call. A detailed three-dimensional image of Xycatica now appeared on the floor directly in front of her. The doctor took a small sideways glance at the keeper and bodyguard before quickly settling his gaze back to the Queen.
I hope for your sake that you have an exceptionally good reason for calling doctor, or you may very well find yourself needing a doctor all of your own.
Of course, my Queen, but I nevertheless felt it was crucially important to inform you of some truly astonishing news the moment your trip was over, which I trust was as pleasant as it was rejuvenating.
You ended it too early,
Xitalia replied churlishly, causing the priestess to wince visibly.
Let's just say that we were in the middle of a rather pleasant conversation, which was then very rudely cut short. Next time I visit this particular thread, I think a slightly higher dose would very much be in order, so be sure to make a note for your successors. But you didn't call me just to exchange inane pleasantries, so out with it, Doctor. What exactly is this so-called news that evidently could not wait until my return?
My Queen, it is with regards to the pending replacement of Xicadian 110. An eligible candidate hatched early this morning, and against all odds I am very pleased to announce that for the first time in the entire history of Nest Xitalia, you finally have the Shihari general that you have always dreamed of.